Hey, welcome to the Cheap Air Gunner channel. I'm Cherokee Steve. Forewarning before the video starts. This is going to be the talking video about refinishing my flash pub wooden stock. I did a quick video that was pretty much all picture and video related. Would go by very quick and give a picture story version of the process. So if you're more interested in, if you're interested in the project and you don't want to hear a lot of talking, you don't need to hear a lot of talking, maybe you're very experienced in refinishing gun stocks and woodworking projects in general, I would recommend checking that out. But this particular video is specifically for those like me who aren't experienced at all in any refinishing of wood products, especially gun stocks, which is what I did in this particular case. So let's get to it. Let's start at the beginning. Everything gets stripped off of the gun, which in this case wasn't very much, and get it down to just obviously the wood stock itself. Now comes the part of stripping the clear coat that Hatsan used and the stain that Hatsan used off of the gun. And my first step in the process, and this was explained in previous videos, was using citrus strip. But one of the things that really helped, that was going to help from this point on, was knowing the grain and shade characteristics of Turkish walnut. That pretty much a straight, uniform color to the project was not going to be the end result. That the pattern of the coloring of Turkish walnut can vary quite a bit, from light spots to darker spots, to really well-defined grain, to less defined grain. I really did some thinking. Now that the stripping process was being productive, that this bleach application was producing positive results, I really started to think about what is it, Steve, that you want the end result to be? What is it that you want to get this stock looking like? And as I said, whatever wood it is you're working with, really look into the characteristics of the wood, and you'll come up with a much more realistic picture of what you can achieve as a possible end result. That's important to do. And that is something that I personally really had to prepare for with this project and understand, working with wood, that being a perfectionist in woodworking is not really going to be super cohesive. There are characteristics and aspects to the wood itself that are just going to lend itself to being very unpredictable. From the stripping process, to the staining process, to the sealing process. It's wood. It's a natural material that is going to vary from one piece to the other greatly. You could take a piece of Turkish walnut that was cut from a particular tree, and how it's going to end up being stained and how it's going to end up being looked after sanding and staining and clear coating is going to be completely different than the exact same type of wood cut from a different tree. You know, and really understanding that and really preparing myself for that was a big part of this project, for me anyway. Really was hoping the end result could be similar to, I knew I was not going to achieve this result, but The picture I had in my mind was really well-defined grain and colors in between the grain that really popped. Okay, that's a laminated piece of wood. But the way that the grain is defined in that was really what I was looking for. Something remotely similar. I knew I was not going to be achieving from a solid piece of wood anything close to a laminated wood finish. But it was that pop of the grain that I really thought I could remotely come close to with my project. That really wasn't a very realistic way to think. Let's take a look at the stock as it appears in its stock form on a stock gun from Hatsan. When you look at those two pictures, I should have immediately understood and really had it sink in really deep. The results come up with much more realistic results. The grain pattern, the definition of the grain in this piece of walnut I was working with just was not going to lend itself to this other picture in my head of the grain of a laminated piece of wood. The other thing that I want to point out at this particular point that I should have prepared myself better for, going back to investigating and doing research on Turkish walnut itself, it's just like any other type of wood. It comes in different grades. And understanding that I'm sure Hatsan has multiple piles of Turkish walnut in their factory that they use for different stocks. And at a price point of under $400 for the flash pup, the Turkish walnut and the grade of walnut that's going to be used to produce those stocks is not going to be the same for a more higher end Turkish walnut stock air gun that they make in another area of their factory. One of the guns that they make that I just absolutely adore the Turkish walnut stock on is the Nova Star. Now you're talking about a price point of just under $900 retail for the Nova Star versus just under $400 for the Flash Pup. And obviously, one of the areas they're going to save money and be able to come up with the retail price of under $400 for the Flash Pup is the grade of walnut that they're going to be using to produce that particular stock. It's obvious that there's much more millwork and machining that goes into making the Nova Star stock, but I am also 100% certain that the grade of walnut that they use is much higher for that Nova Star. When you look at the picture of the Nova Star and the grain texturing that's involved with that stock versus the very plain Jane look of the Flash Pup and the not so well defined grain patterns of the Flash Pup walnut stock, you get it. And expect it, just from a realistic standpoint, understanding not the laminated stock, just compare these two Turkish walnut stocks made by the same manufacturer. The Flash Pup versus the Nova Star. There's no way I'm going to get the Flash Pup stock to look anything like the Nova Star's stock. So, you know, reality really started to set in. I was happy with the results of the bleaching. After being happy with the results of the bleaching and pretty much figuring a big chunk of the stripping process was over with, I went into the sanding, because one of the things I explained in a prior video was the bleaching and the real soaking process of the bleach really brought out texture and grain of the wood to the point where it was much more rough feeling after completing the bleaching process versus prior to starting the bleaching process. And definitely sanding was needed. And working from 150 grit to 220 grit to finishing up with 320 grit, I really was happy with the sanding results. Now, the sanding itself brought out some of the different colorization of the wood in different areas. It brought out much more defined grain of the wood, but the very light areas of the wood that I was really attracted to, I quickly realized upon the sanding of the technique that there are areas of this walnut that just aren't that color. It's more of an orange, pinkish hue. And no matter how much sanding you do in those areas, you're not going to lighten it up and get it to match the lighter shades of the walnut that might be right next to this area that has this pinkish look to it. It's something you just have to accept, that this is one of the characteristics and aspects of working with wood. So after doing the sanding and getting to a point in the sanding process that I was really happy with, I wiped down the stock with mineral spirits, let it dry extremely thoroughly, and was ready to start with the staining process. Really, again, not knowing for certain what I was going for. I certainly knew and was prepared for what I most certainly was not going to be achieving with this stock. But what I could achieve with this stock was still an unknown to me. The first step I took after the bleaching and the sanding aspect and pretty much the stripping aspect was complete of the wood. Prior to staining, I had purchased and watched videos on people that used a wood conditioner. It seemed like the main reason behind using a wood conditioner that some of these people were using it much more experienced with woodworking than I am. The reason behind using it was that it really brings out the grain of the wood without raising the grain of the wood, simply bringing out the grain in appearance. So it really was, in their opinion, a good step to take in between stripping and sanding and prior to staining, using a wood conditioner. Now, one of the things I noticed on the back of all of the cans of Varathane stain I was contemplating using was that particular style of stain. It said on the can, a wood conditioner is not needed. That the stain itself is supposed to really bring out the grain in the wood. But I had already purchased it and I thought I would use it. And the way that it went on, it definitely darkened the color of the wood. But it had a very mineral spirit type smell to it. And having wiped down the wood with mineral spirits after completing the sanding process and letting it dry real thoroughly, it went from, the initial wipe down, which made the wood darker, to thoroughly drying out and lightening up considerably from when it was originally wiped down with the mineral spirits. And I was hoping that was going to be the case with the wood conditioner. based on the smell of it, I'm like, the darkening of this wood reminds me of what happened when I wiped it down with the mineral spirits. And that's certainly what it smells like. So if I just let it sit, let it dry real thoroughly from the wood conditioner, it'll probably get back to the lightened color that it was prior to wiping with the wood conditioner. I decided to use that time as it was drying. Again, should have done it beforehand, but do some online research on wood conditioning and use it and using wood conditioner. There's a lot of contradictory information between letting it dry 48 hours and not letting it dry. That a complete drying process of the wood conditioner is much more likely to result in blotchiness of your stain. So the can recommended 30 minutes, I believe, to let the wood conditioner work. And ultimately, I decided use the recommendation by the manufacturer. So after letting the wood conditioner dry for a period, it definitely was darker than it had been after bleaching and sanding, but this is what it recommended. And I went into the staining process from there. So the stain I decided to start out with was by Varathane. It's a color they call Fogstone. And prior to purchasing it and going online and looking at the different shades of stain that were offered by Varathane, I've used Varathane stains in the past with success with some outdoor wood furniture projects. Very simple, very quick staining projects. It's not something I would, as I said before, I consider myself to be really not experienced whatsoever in woodworking. Not completely unexperienced, but the experience I had, I've had positive results from the Varathane. This Fogstone really kind of stood out to me. Grayish in color, but with some bluish tones to it. Now, of course, what you're looking at as a representative picture of this stain's color on a website by the manufacturer is not going to translate into exactly how it's going to look on whatever it is you're staining. But for some reason, this really stood out to me as a really nice color. Gave somewhat of a weathered look. A stressed, weathered look is what it reminded me of, between the lightness of the color and yet the combination of the color of the grays and the blues. I thought it was a pretty cool stain color, and my local Home Depot had it in stock. So I went and picked up a can of it. That's what I started my staining with, this Fogstone. Now you have to experiment. How long are you going to let the stains seep in and sit on the wood until you start wiping it away? I believe I was going for about 3 to 4 minutes with my first application of the stain. The Fogstone was giving the results I thought it would give. Although it was darker than I had a picture of in my mind, it wasn't excessively dark. There were areas, especially those areas that seemed to be of a pinkish tone, that it wasn't penetrating as much as it was in the other lighter areas. So there were definitely variations in the look of the wood. Didn't have a uniform look to it, but that was okay. I was good with that. But I did want to lighten up the look of it. And one of the things I already had from a previous project, quite honestly, the wood pump handle I had installed on my Crossman 2289, I attempted to stain. I ultimately ended up painting it, but tried to stain with a varathane stain whose shade was called Weathered Gray, which seemed to have a much lighter, brighter look to it than the Fogstone. So I decided to try that and do a coat of that over the Fogstone. At the end result of that stain being applied and wiping off the excess and allowing it to dry, I definitely had the thought process of where the stain was taking this particular stock, and that was a weathered, stressed look. Which I was perfectly okay with. The look of the stock at this particular point I was much happier with than the stock Hotson supplied, very dark, very non-grain producing shade of brown, dark brown, that it came with out of the box. I was much happier with the way that it looked, but it seemed to me that it was missing something. And it was at this point I contemplated going with something much darker that I was hoping wouldn't cover excessively what was already there, but really bring out the grain of the wood. And for a little bit, I contemplated going darker, getting a ebony black stain, hoping that it would only bring out the grain of the wood in a much darker tone and really contrast this gray, weathered, stressed look with other areas of the grain that would really pop being a darker color. But I went through, again, my cabinet in my garage that did have the little amount of woodworking equipment that I had as far as stains in clear coat. And one of the stains I had another can of varathane stain that was called Antique White. And I decided, before investing more money, going out to the hardware store and picking up, I didn't have anything that was black in color. And I kind of initially thought, you know, one of the main purposes of this project was to definitely go lighter than what the stock appeared out of the box. So I took the Antique White and tried it on a small area of the stock. Let it sit for a very short period of time and wiped it. And it seemed in certain areas to really achieve what I was hoping, and that was to really bring out the grain of the wood. So I went ahead and did a very fast application over the entire stock with the Antique White, over the Fogstone and Weathered Gray. Did not let it sit for very long whatsoever, and wiped off the excess and let it dry. And I was really happy with how it looked. So at that point, I pretty much determined I was done with the staining process. Once again, to quickly recap, the staining process involved using wood conditioner, Varathane Fogstone, Varathane Weathered Gray, and Varathane Antique White. And it really had that weathered, stressed look to it. Stressed like this particular piece of wood may have sat out prior to finishing it. I really liked that style of look and was happy with how it looked. So I was ready to move on to top coating everything. At this particular point, the preparation I made between the stain completely drying and going into applying a clear top coat, I used some gray Scotch-Brite. I did have a very fine grit of sandpaper that I had purchased in preparation for this project that I hadn't used up to this point. I had used the 150, I used the 220 and the 320. I had 420 grit sandpaper. And did a little bit of contemplating between, do I use the 420 grit sandpaper to prep the stain stock for the clear coat, or do I use, and I had a couple of brand new, unused Scotch-Brite pads, some being red in color and some being gray. And gray is the finer of the two grits, so to speak, associated with Scotch-Brite pads. So very lightly and very quickly, going back and forth over the stained wood with the gray Scotch-Brite pad gave a result I was really happy with. Kind of added to the weathered look and definitely smoothed out any areas that needed to be smoothed out following the staining process. All I used to clean it off, I didn't want to go back over with mineral spirits and possibly lighten areas of stained wood that I didn't want lightened. So I just used compressed air after using the gray Scotch-Brite to clean off the stock. And now I determined I was ready for the top layer of clear. In preparation for the project, again, you're doing research into other top coats that people have used. And I know, the True Oil is a very popular method going into this. There was a project that was done and videoed the process specifically pertaining to a flash pup wooden stock that one particular gentleman used. His top coat that he used was just a straight clear gloss enamel. So it went all the way from watching video such as that with a very, very bright glossy top coat to a much more subtle but yet glossy finish offered by True Oil. I would say those were the two opposite ends of the clear coat spectrum, True Oil and a gloss clear enamel, with tons of things in between: polyurethane, varnish, satin looks, gloss looks. I did want something that would offer a pretty decent level of protection to the stock, as far as already investing the time that was invested and not wanting this to be a source of constant maintenance, reapplying a product that would have to continuously bring out the gloss finish. What I ended up deciding on was spray-on lacquer. I watched a video by a person that used a different type of clear top coat, and I believe it was polyurethane. They were not happy with the end results and actually stripped off the top coat they originally used and used a spray-on lacquer. And I really liked the end result of the stock of that particular video. And this particular gentleman used Deft was the brand, D-E-F-T. It's available at Blaine's Farm and Fleet, which I have one located fairly close to me. A gloss finish, and that's what I went with. Reasonably priced, good finish left in this particular video that I watched, and seemed to be something I would try. So that's what I purchased. A couple of cans of that stuff. Definitely a learning process involved with using lacquer. Again, I fault myself for once again not researching and doing the homework that should have been involved with just looking into what lacquer is and what's involved with the use of it. Once again, I thought it was easy as simply strictly following the instructions on the can. This is the product that I used. Available at Blaine's Farm and Fleet. Not sponsored by them. Purchased with my own money. But the instructions on the can are very minimalistic. It goes over surface preparation and recommends 220 grit sandpaper to prepare your surface. As far as the application instructions, you want to cover nearby surfaces and provide adequate ventilation. You want to shake the can for 1 minute. It does warn you that no marble is present, so you're not going to get any rattling. But thoroughly shake it up for at least a minute. Spray 6 to 10 inches from the surface. Apply thin coats and recoat in 30 minutes. Recoat 3 or more times. That's pretty much it. So it seemed like the recommendation was to shake the can for a minute. Don't expect any rattling. You're not going to get it. Hold the can 6 to 10 inches and apply thin coats. Okay, well, personally, that wording is very much understated. I applied the first coat. I was doing this now. It had warmed up quite a bit, so I was doing this in my garage, which I highly recommend. The odor of the lacquer is very strong. You do need a very well ventilated area to apply this. Actually, within the past 48 hours, between starting the top coating process and ultimately finishing it, we have gone from a 70-degree day to snow on the ground. So I started it on a 70-degree day out in my garage. In preparing yourself for top coating anything with wood, you come across the obvious recommendation that you do this in a dust-free environment. Well, if you're like me, you're doing this somewhere in or near your home and you don't have a paint booth that has a giant vacuum system as a part of it, there really isn't a dust-free environment you're going to have. I have 2 dogs, so anywhere you go within my house, you don't have a dust-free environment. There are little particles of lots of different things: pet dander, pet fur, and everything else that you would normally find in, a home floating around. So again, prepare yourself. Are you going to get a crystal clear, perfectly uniform top coat to your project? Most likely not. So someone like me, again, prepare yourself with a realistic expectation of what is going to be the end result. Well, after the first coat of what I would consider to be a very thin coat, I let it dry 30 minutes, and that is one of the aspects of lacquer that should be understood. It is extremely fast drying. It pretty much doesn't just dry to the touch in 30 minutes, it's cured in 30 minutes. But I would later learn something about lacquer that I hadn't really investigated and done my homework on prior to the start of the clear coat application. I waited 30 minutes after the first application, went out to the garage to do a second application. I had the gun hanging from an unwound wire coat hanger, bent to go through one of the mounting holes in the stock from the inside out, so that there wasn't any coverage of the wire that it was hanging from, blocking any area that needed to be sprayed, and yet pretty adequately supported the weight of the stock, hanging from a beam in my garage. So the stock was hanging vertically. And I went out to do the second coat, and what I noticed when I got to a particular area and the light was shining in the right way on the stock was that either during the application of the first coat or the second coat or both, I had oversprayed. There was some serious running of the lacquer. And again, this is using what I would consider to be a light coat, and that is the only way it's defined on the can itself of the product, to use light coats. What it should say, what I would reword that as, is super light, extremely thin coats. A past version of myself that would have been in the exact same situation, going out and in the middle of applying a second coat of this lacquer, coming across these running gobs of lacquer, would have freaked out. But I didn't. I stopped applying the second coat. Went inside, started to do some searching on the internet and doing my homework on how to repair runs and drips in lacquer. And pretty much what you come across was the exact same process you would use for any running of any type of top coat. And that's let it dry very thoroughly, completely, and then use a very fine grit of sandpaper and sand down the high spots of the runs and the drips. And then try reapplying. This particular article I was dealing with, and I'm going to throw up here, I don't know if the whole thing's going to show up and be legible on the screen. But the key point of the article prepared me more from this point on that I should have went in to the start of the application of the top coat with this particular knowledge. But that particular area of the article really emphasized some of the properties of lacquer that I should have been prepared for prior to using it. It's extremely prone to running and dripping. The coats that you're going to use aren't just thin coats, at least what I define as a thin coat. It's, again, like I said, a super thin, extremely light coat is what you're going to use. A very quick passage of this, adequately pulled back from the object you're spraying to avoid runs and drips. The reactivation process of a coat of lacquer to the previous coat of lacquer, that although it dries very quickly and dries to the state that it's pretty much going to dry to very quickly, that as soon as you put on an additional coat over what you already put on, it is going to re-wet and reactivate the previous coat of lacquer that you've already used. And if you can at all come up with a way to go about applying lacquer, hanging something vertically is not a really good way to go about doing it. Because you have that re-wetting, you have gravity working against you, which is constantly pulling down on multiple coats of lacquer, which are getting heavier and heavier and thicker, and being reactivated with each and every coat that you use. Again, just emphasizing the extremely thin coats you're going to be applying. And it is going to take multiple applications of this in an extremely thin application process to get any type of decent result. But I did go about letting that second coat, really more like 1.5 coats of lacquer, drying as much as it could. Now I used my 420 grit sandpaper in a wet condition to try to sand down the high spots of the runs and drips. And it turned out, upon really studying this stock in the proper lighting, that it was more than just these 2 runs that I needed to deal with. One of the positives that came out of using the sandpaper in a wet condition was the difficulty anyone is going to have, including myself, of only sanding the high spot as you're sanding an area where a run has been produced. You're going to do some sanding to the surrounding area, and exactly how thick the lacquer is in those areas, it's going to be much thinner, obviously, than where your run is. But what I noticed with the wetness, that as I tried to focus on the high spot, but obviously was sanding into the surrounding area, that as soon as my sandpaper was going in areas completely through the lacquer and making contact with the stain, the water would cloud up and be gray in color, like the stain is. And then I knew it was wiped down the moisture very thoroughly, inspect the drip to see if it was gone. If it wasn't, really focus more on only getting the sandpaper on what was left of a high spot and not the surrounding areas. But it worked out pretty good as far as the wet sanding aspect and knowing when I was inadvertently going completely through the lacquer and now was making contact with the stained surface, because now the water really came through as gray. And taking a much more careful approach at that point with my sanding process. It was at this point, it was clear to me that what my original definition of a thin coat of lacquer was nowhere near as thin of a coat as it should have been. So rehanging the stock and reapplying the lacquer in extremely light coats, waiting a half an hour in between those extremely light coats and reapplying was getting this back to a condition I was satisfied with. The thick run and dripping areas were removed and really weren't evident at all after applying the lacquer correctly. Now, I ultimately did 11 applications of extremely thin coats over and over again. I'm pretty close to having used one complete can. And I'm really satisfied with the results I've gotten as far as a gloss sheen without drowning out the stain color. It's really making the stain pop, yet seems to be a thick enough top coat that it really would offer protection to the stain surface underneath. And there's no need, in my opinion, to go any thicker. I have another can of the stuff. Once you get down to the bottom quarter of any spray-on application, whether it be spray paint or anything else that I've come across that comes out of a can and is sprayed on, you risk the lower and lower you get to the bottom portion of the contents to it spraying out in a blotchy, splotchy type of application. So this seems to be a good time to stop. Between knowing that and knowing how the stock looks, I'm going to stop applying the lacquer. But that results in some shots I'm going to take of the stock in its completed form prior to anything being added back onto the stock. And then I'll take some shots of it applied with the gun reassembled completely. And again, I'm happy with the results. The one thing I keep going back and reminding myself of and looking at a picture of is the stock in its form out of the box. And really reminding myself of how much I really did not care for and disliked the finish on the stock out of the box. Not focusing on imperfections in the way Hatsan applied what they did as far as a stain or a top coat, just the shade itself. That even with a cheap grade of walnut, there are aspects, positive aspects to using walnut versus other types of wood that can really be taken advantage of with a proper staining and proper top coating process that makes for a much more interesting looking gun than just a dark brown. So that's what I keep trying to focus on. How much happier I am and more pleased I am with how it turned out versus the way it was out of the box. And I really didn't have the ability, quite honestly, to form a realistic expectation until you get into the project. That's something you have to be prepared for. Hopefully, I know this was a lot of talking. Hopefully, it provided some information to the people out there who are contemplating, maybe first time contemplating, refinishing a wood stock. Let me know what you think of the ultimate finished product that I came up with as far as the refinishing. Again, I'm happy with it. Really, personally believe it's an improvement over that very dark, plain brown version of the stock that came out of the box. So hopefully this could be of some help. I really, really, really am hoping that it is. For you first time stock refinishing project guys, if you have a wooden stock and you want to tackle refinishing it, you certainly can do it with little to no experience, as I have. Prepare yourself for the expectations and the end result to be not what you ultimately wanted, but certainly better than what you had. That's what I would take from this. So, do we have some other videos coming up and plans for videos in the future? And thank you for checking this one out, guys. Stay safe and shoot straight.